I'll be talking for about 10-15 minutes. I think more, maybe like 15 minutes to just start the conversation. And then I do hope that I can take questions and we can have more of a conversation as we proceed. My present task is to introduce my book to you, to those of you who have not read it, and perhaps to intrigue you to read it afterwards. And for those of you who may have read my book, I'd like to try to intersperse a few of my more recent musings about it to keep things a little more interesting for you and to get our conversation going. Flowering Tales, Women Exorcising History in Heian Japan, offers a reading of Eiga Monogatari, A Tale of Flowering Fortunes, a historical tale written in the 11th century. Although the genre of the historical tale, Rekishi Monogatari, is anachronistic and problematic, and treated by Erin Brightwell in her recent book, and she does a much better job covering this genre than I do and the problems associated with it. A historical tale in this case basically means a court chronicle written in kana, with the attending slant in its coverage. As the title implies, it is heavily indebted to the Monogatari, namely the tale of Genji. And one of my main concerns in the book is to think about how works such as Genji Monogatari opened the way to writing history in the vernacular and what that means. The first 30 chapters roughly covered the years 950 to 1030. The last 10 chapters, the so-called Zokuhen, from 1030 to 1100. And as Professor Laffin was saying, it hasn't attracted that much notice, but I have posted my translation of the last 10 chapters on my university webpage. So it's there. And if you do notice a mistake or a problem, please let me know. I am a little embarrassed how amateurish my WordPress skills are, but I'm hoping to perhaps make it a little more attractive in the coming years. I've also posted there some work by my students. So if you're curious, please take a look. And of course, as many of you know, there's an excellent translation of the first 30 chapters by Helen and William McCullough from 1980. There were no doubt practical reasons for them not to translate the last 10 chapters. But here and there in their commentary on the work, they betray a defensiveness for its perceived failures. To them, it was neither an accurate history, nor as in the official histories, nor a riveting tale, as in the tale of Genji. The McCulloughs were not the only ones who found Eiga lacking. So often it's been criticized for not being something else. And yes, it is a difficult work with many, many historical figures with similar names. There's very little emplotment. It abounds in seemingly superfluous details. It can be tedious, and if you didn't know the historical background, maybe even incomprehensible. But the sections, for example, covering Empress Takeshi, contrast so vividly with her depiction in Sei Shonagon's The Pillow Book that I found myself drawn to its monumental project, covering numerous generations, inviting, maybe even challenging readers to detect the rhythms of their joys and sorrows. And by rhythms, I'm alluding to how the work actually does structure the past and provide motifs that punctuate the chronology. Part of my project was to recover those refrains because I felt that they paralleled the ways in which we remember. Here I have been inspired by cognitive approaches to literature. Except in Eiga's case, time and culture have made those details pass by without their accompanying meaning. So I became intrigued with Eiga for what it is, despite all its flaws, or more precisely, for all its flaws. After all, despite the historian's desire for accuracy, none of us remember all that precisely. Living through the pandemic, I think we can all agree how our perceptions of time can warp. Deaths, illnesses, and anxieties create powerful patterns in recollection that supersede a clock-like even measuring of time. In many ways, I believe Eiga reflects how we remember, or may want to remember, and can help us understand the uses and needs of memory. To that end, my question increasingly turned from what eiga is to what eiga does. As I started my research, one common approach I noticed consisted of pointing out mistakes in eiga's historical documentation and trying to figure out what went wrong. In the worst case, fussy scholars pointed fingers at the faulty ways women recorded historical events. It was, needless to say, annoying. I then realized, though, that even this approach illuminated how eiga encourages people to engage with the past. This is true for any historical record, but in my experience, contemporaneous courtiers' journals or even women's nikki don't quite have the same effect. This may be because those records are usually anchored to an individual. Even if we don't quite find that voice to be convincing or sympathetic, there's less room for contestation or other points of view. If the Kagero diarist says that that's how she felt, I tend to, at least initially, believe her. In the case of eiga, its narrator often presumes knowledge of things outside her personal purview, thus inviting more skepticism and more room for the reader's imagination. And needless to say, the narrator is not named, right? She's a generic, presumably female attendant that's privy to all the happenings, but is not a specific individual, or as far as we can tell. The authorship is also a big part of eiga scholarship, and I'm not going to really go into it here, but I do talk about the attribution to Agazome Emo in my book if you're interested, and we could also talk about it a little bit later if you like. To enliven the past, the narrator also borrows techniques from the monogatari, assuming what I and others have described as a shamanic stance, zooming in and out of various characters' minds, projecting their inner voices in free interior monologue. Moreover, she guides her readers' reactions by offering her own take, comments such as, "How splendid beyond words." Along with these literary devices, I articulate what I call figural genealogies and the strategy of awase, matching, that structures the narrator's molding of characters and their predicaments. In the end, these techniques foster empathy because they help make legible and communal what may have been otherwise idiosyncratic or alienating personal histories. Reading and telling stories, I think, draws people together and nourishes community. For me, this effect explains a lot about eiga and its historical depiction. As many scholars have pointed out, eiga glorifies Fujiwara no Michinaga's family. As I noted, though, it also devotes considerable attention to his defeated rivals and their suffering, often with a great deal of sympathy. This coverage has been underappreciated. In my book, I proposed that fears about malevolent ghosts, mononoke or onryo, drove eiga's representation. As is well known, many of the era's illnesses were attributed to such spirits, but these illnesses were not randomly diagnosed. Their victims needed to have publicly acknowledged enemies. Otherwise, a more physical ailment or a generic possession would be assigned. The conventional treatment for these possessions called for an exorcist. He would then move the offending spirit to a medium who then would identify the phantom, acting as its ventriloquist. Amidst the chanting, prayers, and the wailing, her retelling of the spirit's grievances formed the central act of the exorcism. To work, these narratives had to elicit understanding and honoring by the community, who then had to judge the exorcism's success. As such, this treatment was a form of storytelling, which eiga replicates. And by narrating their stories through thematic patterns, the narrator embeds these embittered spirits back into the community's fold. By now, you probably have some questions as well as doubts. I have some myself. At the risk of stealing your thunder, I'd like to preemptively express some of my more recent thoughts about my argument. To begin, I'll just admit one nagging problem that I knew existed and tried to clumsily manage, and that consists of proof. Unfortunately, as with many pre-modern works, there isn't a whole lot that reveals how people originally read Eiga. There are a few mentions in slightly later texts, Mumio Zoshi and others, that I can discuss later, but my solution in the book is to use other works, namely Genji, to provide models. In what might be a rather circular approach, I also use Eiga and its narratorial voice that I think guides how we should be reading. Looking back though, one of the bigger problems of my approach may be that I don't question enough whether my responses may be anachronistic and misleading. So far, I have taken small comfort in acknowledging that my interpretation shows Eiga's potential, which no doubt varied from reader to reader. After all, there are those who don't read literature or don't read at all and aren't moved by anything they read or try to read, no matter what. Another related aspect of my book has been occupying me of late as the United States continues to go through a divisive and scary time. As you can see, for better or for worse, my reading habits tend to carry the pre-modern texts I treat into our contemporary world. That's actually true for everybody. And even rejecting such readings is a form of situating oneself, I think, because no one can, and so it's true for everybody. No one really can escape our positionality as readers. But they may not have scattered the sides I left behind in my book. And though I tried to be subtle, I'm sure they annoyed some people. Talking about politics can be fraught. Sometimes in a venue like this one, it can really derail the conversation. So I really timidly broach this topic with sincerity and humility, and I'm curious to engage in conversation with you about it. I still wonder how stories can mediate both division and reconciliation, a message that I embedded in my book, and what lessons we can draw from Eiga Monogatari. In the book, I muse about forgetting and healing, and what the value of remembering history may be. Particularly in the case of Eiga, as I mentioned, it has been blamed for being propaganda. Defective history has resonances with fascist ideologies. Even though I don't say it so explicitly in my book, I am suggesting that Michinaga's family sponsored the work to forward a history advantageous not only to its prestige, but to its very health. For me, despite its moral quandaries, this effect has tremendous value, and I still feel that it may outweigh the value of remembering, as in the cause to remember history so as not to repeat it. That's because to me, and I say it as a teacher of history, it seems impossible, at least so far, for societies to remember, or they remember only selectively, or extract the wrong lessons. The pitfalls are legion. On the individual basis, to not forget means being forever haunted by one's demons. And that to me doesn't really seem like a viable way to live. Now, I know you didn't join me today to hear my ramblings about historical memory, especially since I don't have any answers. But to close my initial remarks, I wanted to say how Eiga continues to linger in my mind. How might we exorcise our demons? The only conclusion I've been able to reach is the significance of storytelling. We need to be aware of how stories, the way they are told and evoke past figures and emotions, have real consequences and do things. I take solace in what I consider to be my book's ultimate message. There is room for multiple voices and renditions of the past, each with its effects and consequences, some negative, but many positive. So in that respect, the question then doesn't have to be about whether I am right or wrong, which ultimately doesn't really matter, or whether Eiga had these particular effects or not, but its potentials, how some people dealt with the challenges of their past and tried to remedy them. That is a task that continues to press us as individuals and as a society, and it may require many, many stories, some of which I hope will move you and me to a more positive place. So that's it for my initial comments, and I'd like to turn it over to Professor Arntzen for her comments about my book.
Oh, thank you. That was a wonderful summation of your book. And I, of course, had read the Ega, had used it as a source, but I felt I had no handle on it. I appreciated that it was a history from told perhaps as women might like to tell history, with lots of personal details, with sort of the private side of life. So I appreciated that. But I couldn't understand, I mean, why so much effort had gone into it. The scale of the work, the length of the work, just a desire to tell all kinds of, say, gossip, you know, it wasn't enough, you know. So, but I found your explanation, and that covers the whole book, you know, because it's such a monumental work, I find, you know, it really covers the Ega with so much detail that it was absolutely convincing. And I really appreciated your commitment to understanding the Ega in its own terms and in the context of its own time, but also with an accompanying commitment to convey that to an audience of a very different place and time. You know? And but I was particularly grateful for the insight that your book gave me into one section of the Kagero diary that had puzzled me for years. And by the way, I completely agree with your assertion of the importance of the Nikki as a source of inspiration for the Ega Monogatari. Certainly the Genji is paramount, but even the Genji was inspired by the Nikki. So, you know, I really agreed with that. The episode that I'm thinking of in the Kagero diary is the where she raises the Ana incident. You know, when Minamoto no Takaakira was banished, you know, in 969. And it's the only political incident that she mentions. And she kind of apologizes for it, saying it's because I personally felt grieved by it, you know. And all her sympathy is with Takaakira and his wife and their children, even though her own husband is one of the primary conspirators in bringing about his downfall and trumping up the charges against him. So it was, and she writes that very long poem, it's a choka, and it's quite moving. Nowhere does she indicate that she has any knowledge of her husband's role in this. Or that indeed, well, Takaakira's only crime was marrying his daughter to the prince they thought would be the next crown prince, and you know, and the Fujiwara scions made sure that didn't happen, and then exiled him to get rid of him. But she doesn't. But it affects her family, the careers of her father, her son. You know, so it was part of what you discuss, I think, or describe so well, that this atmosphere of rivalry and intrigue and treachery that the Heian court was, you know. But so it puzzled me why. Okay, she admits no knowledge of that. You know, she gives all her sympathy to the losers in this rivalry, and was she truly ignorant of what was going on, or is she feigning ignorance? And why does she do it? But your book just threw a light of complete revelation on it for me. And it seems to me that in that actually extended episode, she does what the Ega does throughout its entire length. A woman's voice reaches out to say, I know your pain, or I know, I can imagine the pain of this person, and then retells the suffering empathetically. And it does two things, I think. I do believe that Michitsuna no Haha was upset by this rent in the social fabric. And so it was a kind of balm to her own heart to write it. And then she can reach out and hold it. It's holding something. It's what you talk about it very eloquently, so I've used your words here. It's like a placatory, symbolic place of honor, at least in the telling, but I also realized that her private diary, and private, because she didn't really intend it to be private, becomes part of Kaniie's, her husband's, public record. And so it somehow softens. It gets us into that gray area of whitewashing. If one of his wives expresses this kind of empathetic outpouring for the loser, somehow it softens kind of the treachery itself. But it's not just whitewashing. I agree with you that somehow these narratives provided a way to hold that society together, despite all the intrigue, despite all the treachery. So anyways, thank you for that. And I have just one question for you. And it's, by the way, I really liked the analogies you drew to contemporary phenomena as a way to help readers understand. I don't think that's distorts at all, because you admit it's an analogy. Look, it's not exactly like this, but here's a way you can imagine it. And our imaginations are so important. We've been watching a lot of Ken Burns documentaries, and well, I was trying to think, when I got this invitation, it came to me that Ken Burns' documentaries of American history are a kind of empathetic history. The way you describe the Ega make it seem in some ways unique, and it was unique for its time. And it is the origin of a genre. But I was trying to think, has such a thing happened, later as well? And not that Ken Burns would have been influenced at all. And it's particularly, since your opening remarks, your mention of this time in America with the country almost as divided as the Civil War. It's particularly his long series on the Civil War that I was thinking of, where to my mind, he somehow manages to tell the story of the South in an empathetic way. And so anyways, I was inviting. Do you think that that's an analogy that works at all, or what are the differences and so on?
So I'll just take the moment right now to just respond, and I don't I think that's okay, right? And so yes, since you introduced Ken Burns to me, who I did not know, I did watch a segment of his Civil War documentary and was quite intrigued and kind of got into it. But I think definitely, right? And in some ways, you know, today there's affective history in in so many areas, right? I mean, and that I think it's part of how history gets told so often. I think today, in trying to get us on board with a perspective, or to also elicit feelings and to elicit a certain reaction. But especially in the documentary on the Civil War, I did find that his use of, polyvocal techniques, or having voiceovers, and just many voices that entered into trying to illuminate the time period, whether it's slaves or Northerners or Southerners, and trying to um, recreate those voices, enliven those voices. And there was also like background music, whether it's guns going, or gospel, or music, or there just were ways, I thought, very similar to, I think, how maybe Eiga did not have those technologies, obviously, right? But for its time, I think the Monogatari was this attempt to resurrect and to recreate those voices in a multi-sensory, kind of a very shamanic way. And so I thought in that respect, the documentaries were quite similar. It's just also, I was inspired in some ways in my argument with uh, discussions about virtual reality and video games even, and also just ways in which museums have now tried to be more interactive and to also recreate stories, right? And purposely not to engage our emotions, to engage our senses. And I think so many, maybe in the future, that we'll get more and more of those kinds of attempts that engage us even more viscerally, right, than possible today, perhaps. Um, and just to also thank you so much for all your comments, generous comments about my book and my argument. I really appreciate them. And the Kagero is the Anna incident section. I hadn't really linked the two together, but I think what you're saying makes absolute sense, and it just is really interesting to see how Michitsuna no Haha, and she's acting as you say, like Kanei is the bad cop, good cop kind of pairing, and how her work somehow mellows or allows Kanei's machinations to kind of hide or soften his persona because they're linked. And so, Michinaga also maybe an Akazome Emon, right? And how her, or the authors of Eiga, and how they're able to perhaps soften the internecine kind of the hostile rivalries, and especially since the rivals are defeated in some ways, Michinaga's side had all the reasons and all the no reason not to try to actually soften and to actually reconcile and get them back and to quiet their ghosts and the possible retribution.
No, I just made a few comments I wanted to read out first before asking my question. Up until now, I've been primarily engaged with Eiga Monogatari through the appendices to the McCullough's 1980 rendition, which offer convenient translations for every office and branch of court government. Despite this comprehensiveness, and despite being published in 2 volumes, amounting to nearly 1,000 pages in total, the 1980 translation leaves out the final 10 chapters, as Professor Watanabe has noted, an omission that speaks eloquently in its own way to the daunting size and scope of this monogatari. Both Eiga's encyclopedic qualities and its dual status as a work of literature and history are done full justice in Professor Watanabe's book, which skillfully traces patterns of similarity and difference among the tale's high-ranking female characters and their families, patterns that are mobilized to repair the fragile community of the 11th century court by activating fiction's capacity for empathy through such narrative devices as interior monologue, which is particular to Monogatari, as Professor Watanabe argues. In addition to significantly enriching my understanding of Eiga's text in the immediate historical context that generated it, this book also makes a welcome intervention more broadly in the field of Heian studies by stressing the similarities between both fictional and historical narratives, as well as between diaries in Kanbun and Kana, on account of their shared interest in gossip, affect, and omission. I thought the ways in which you read silences in particular were very enlightening and enjoyable to me. I'm also excited by the possibilities the book proposes for thinking with knowing caution, as the author puts it, about the ways in which the world of Heian court women resonates with our own. In the author's words, and I quote, their networks of figures consisting of connections real and removed was akin to those of contemporary social media, composed of friends, genuine and not so genuine, sharing virtual selective experiences in multimedia snapshots strung along as an ever-flowing timeline, end of quote. In addition to enhancing our students' engagement with the texts we teach, identifying the modern in the pre-modern in this way inverts the former's linear teleology by illustrating how technological advancement can also take us back to earlier times. As someone with an interest in Waka, for example, I'm also often struck by the ways in which our own intensely epistolary culture of texting and tweets highlights the fraught nature then and now of communicating affect through writing, its capacity to be misread when brief, and its volatile relationship to private and public spheres. Professor Watanabe's focus on death and its aftermath also resonates with our present moment in unexpectedly powerful ways. By forcing us to reckon with an immediate and pervasive sense of mortality, the pandemic has had a profoundly unsettling effect on our own assumptions about modern life. For me, at least, this book has been a comfort as well as an inspiration in helping to think through our extraordinary fragility as individuals and communities at this particular moment, something that Flowering Tales achieves by highlighting our desire to control chaos through causality and narrative, by drawing attention to the emotional costs of delayed mourning, and by foregrounding the potential for communal healing contained in the exercise of empathy across political divisions and the casting of collective trauma in aesthetic terms. And those last 2 points, to what sort of encapsulates them for me in relationship to this book, as a US citizen, seeing President Biden's inauguration, it was, of course, for many people a moment of celebration, but it was also a moment of mourning. I felt we hadn't had an opportunity, at least in this country, publicly to acknowledge what is still ongoing in terms of our loss. And to see that represented aesthetically through the flags, you know, there weren't crowds there, there were just these silent monuments to all the people who have died, made it somehow more, well, helped with the healing, I think, or at least it did with me. So all those things, obviously, this book was not written with that in mind, but with the moment we're in, I just felt it was another way in which it really powerfully led me to think about the divisions between the modern and the pre-modern and how tentative they are. So those are my comments. Like any stimulating study, this one inevitably inspires questions that go beyond its own immediate scope. And one of them, Professor Watanabe already anticipated, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it. And the question is, how does this study of Eiga Monogatari fit within a modern literary genealogy that views it as the first Rekshi Monogatari?
All right. Well, if you like, I don't know if you have more questions, but maybe
No, that's it.
Okay. Yes, and I think, and to be upfront, we did correspond a little bit about this already, but I just want to give a shout out to Professor Aaron Brightwell's book on the mirrors genre, which I think does a much more thorough job in dealing with the genre of the Rekshi Monogatari. And I think I'll just say that, suffice it to say that it actually emerges more in the Meiji period. And in some ways, it's this way of thinking about history as being told through the language of tales. And almost this idea of fiction being, or history being fictionalized. And so the literary qualities of a Rekishi Monogatari become how they were made into fiction, right? Which doesn't quite do it justice. In some ways, the whole Rekishi Monogatari genre is a very demeaning one because it almost makes it feel that it's somehow not history, right? And that it's somehow lesser than. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, unfortunately, I think the emphasis for Rekishi Monogatari has been that it's not really it's not even a very good monogatari, right? Especially because Genji is so monumental that anything compared to Genji does leave a lot to be desired. So, and another problem I think with the whole genre is that it's tended to be kana or oriented toward the vernacular, and also because gunkimono emerged at the same time when the literary history of Japanese literature was being written, the Meiji period. All those other kinds of like Taiheiki, Heike Monogatari, and other things that deal with warfare got cut off into this whole other genre. So in some ways, it left out, it was very artificial, I think. But it also links to a very important conversation of the Fireflies chapter, the Hotaru Monogatari-ron, where Genji does talk about how it's the monogatari that actually tells the real history. And I discussed this scene in my book, and I think it's really probably the inspiring moment or the inspiration for Eiga's project. But there's a lot of different ways to parse it. And is it the idea that the official histories can't tell this whole story, and so Eiga Monogatari is an attempt to try to tell the whole story, or is it that? And there's multiple ways to parse it. And the way that I understood it is, again, that there's this whole emotional side to history and to and the ways that it's used, so that the monogatari itself, I also try to problematize as it's not necessarily fiction, right? That even Genji was understood to be historical, and it was a very malleable kind of narrative. But so can we look more to monogatari as certain techniques, such as interior monologue and narratorial interjection, and not so much focus on the gendering or the fact that also it's written in kana, that there are these real ways in which the monogatari, that the past, the historical content could be told as a tale, could be told as a monogatari that had very real consequences and that had very real uses in the late Heian context.
Well, we have quite a number of questions which have come in already. So maybe we'll start with one that was posted quite early about why these texts have survived. Is it a fluke? What needs of the court or the society they meet that might explain their place in the canon? Or is that simply accidental?
Yeah, so I suppose there could be something accidental sometimes, the ways in which manuscripts survive can be tenuous, and some things just are lost. And so actually, in terms of Rekishi Monogatari, I would, the Mumio Zoshi, for example, mentions Ama no Koromo, or this text that is supposedly a Rekishi Monogatari, but we don't, or covers historical events, but that's the only thing we really have is the title, right? So there are works that unfortunately have not survived. That said, I do think that the works that have survived for a reason sometimes, right? That there were probably enough copies, or that they were very important, and that they were somehow preserved. There are some speculations, again, that Eiga Monogatari was very important for the Fujiwara family, but that they also almost monopolized it, that they didn't really spread it in the same way. And so the earliest manuscript we do have of Eiga Monogatari dates to the Kamakura period. So it does date, fairly close to the Heian period, but the original doesn't exist. And actually, just to clarify, the background image that I have today is from a 14th century illustrated scroll, the Komakurabe Gyoko Emaki. It was actually in the Genji exhibition at the Metropolitan before the pandemic. And so I was thankfully able to see it at the Metropolitan, but it is a national treasure, I believe. And so Professor Laffin's background is close up, and I have the entire view. There is another scene in this Emaki, but that's the only scene that has survived in illustrated form. So obviously it was important, and people were reading it, but also on the subject of references to Eiga Monogatari in its early, the earliest responses are again from Mumio Zoshi and also Sanuki no Suke Nikki, which mentions using Eiga Monogatari as a historical source for protocol, right, and knowing how to handle certain ceremonies. So in that respect, I think, it complicates, or actually maybe doesn't really help me prove my argument of Eiga's placatory power, that it was, but again, there are, I think, multiple ways in which people engage with text. So that's certainly and there's not enough evidence really to say that one reading is more viable than other. Yeah.
One of the questions which just came in now, and I invite Drs. Arntzen and Heldt to jump in at any point, but there was a recent question asking about Eiga and how everyone had alluded to the fact that there was a natural break, or that there was some reason that the last 10 chapters were not translated by the McCulloughs. And so could you expand on that a bit more in terms of, is this a matter of just the authorship changing? Or should this be considered a completely separate work in terms of the Zoku Eiga? How does that work?
Okay, I kind of missed, I was distracted a little bit, and I kind of, because I was looking at the chat myself, and then trying to also reading all the things that were going on that I didn't notice before. Okay, but I would just say that the Zokuhen, they say that it's even more tedious and boring. And it's, I'm paraphrasing, and I think they were a little bit more tactful. But my impression of their comments about the Zokuhan were that, like, it's worthless, and so we didn't do it, which isn't what they said. But that's what sticks in my mind. And I've translated the last 10 chapters. I don't know if that's accurate. I think it's not in any way, I think. It's pretty much in the same vein, I think, then although there are particularities that emerge in the last 10 chapters. There is also something to be said for the authorship of the last 10 chapters is known to be much more fragmented. In fact, there are probably 3 authors that have been identified, or at least 3. And the whole authorship issue, I don't really want to get into too much unless you want me to, or if people are really interested. But I think with because there clearly are it's been even in the earlier chapters attributed to Akazome Emon, there's been a lot of editing of other people's work that's been happening. So that's why it's a very complicated issue. But I do think that the Zokuhen is a little more fragmented in that way, and perhaps that makes it less attractive. I think practically speaking, I do wonder whether they just felt that their translation was just getting too long and they couldn't really make it longer, and there was a page limit. Having published my book, I maybe it wasn't the case in 1980, but I know, like, people don't like to publish long books anymore. So maybe, I don't know what the case, and with the appendices and everything going on with the McCulloughs and their towering achievement. Really, I think I don't want to dismiss what they achieved. Actually, it was I think, a monumental work, and I think we've all used it for the appendices and for their clarifications of the Heian court system. And so I think maybe they just, yeah. So I don't really have a good explanation for why they didn't translate the last 10, but I think it's certainly very interesting. And I think my last chapter, my 5th chapter, deals with it a little more specifically, the Zokuhei.
We have a whole number of more specific questions, but I wanted to ask a broader one with hopes that maybe Sonja and Gus could also jump in related to this. A historian, I believe, has raised this issue of affective histories and how this carries through perhaps as a tradition, seeing this, for example, after the unification era, following Sekigahara, and focusing on those on the losing side. Can each of you speak to this in ways that you see that run through your work or not? Maybe starting with you, Takeshi, because it's related to your work first.
Yes. Okay. So, yeah, I didn't really mean to suggest that Eiga is the only or is the original place for affective history, so I think it actually appears in many guises, and perhaps, you know, I don't know how you all, those of you who have read my book, I know there's been a little pushback from some people about my argument about Eiga's placatory role, but you know, there have been people like Umehara Takeshi who's I don't know what his reputation today is like, or what people think about his work, but I think he's argued that like all of Japanese culture is about placating spirits, right? And that and of course he had the very famous work, or he's the one who proposed that the Yume Dono, at Horyuji, and that the Prince Shotoku had to be like kind of appeased, right? And so that statue was a way to kind of placate his spirit and so forth. And I mention it again because I think there are ways in which that a lot of Japanese culture could be argued is a form of placating spirits, right? And trying to rewrite or provide solace to the defeated side through a certain affective performative technique. So, for example, but I try to say that the Heike Monogatari is part of this lineage, right? Or even things like the No Theater, I think, also are very much part about not rewriting history per se, but to trying to honor the losing side and those who may have resentments towards the winners.
Well, it's already been said, but my impression was when I read Professor Watanabe's book was that the Heike Monogatari and the Eiga Monogatari are intimately linked with this. All the stories of the, you know, like the Gyo stories, or the stories of all the court women and so on. I've forgotten who's written quite extensively about the Heike's placatory role, but it made perfect sense to me. So, yeah.
Quick point about effective history. One of the aspects of the book that I found really striking, and I think speaks to a very particular kind of history that I haven't found anywhere else, is the use of interior monologue. I think if people can think of other pre-modern narratives other than fiction where that's used extensively, there aren't any coming to mind for me. But I think that's one thing that Professor Watanabe zeroes in on with Eiga Monogatari that makes it special and makes his argument special as well.
Quite a lot of interior monologue in the Nikki.
Yeah.
When you think about it.
Well,
I'm sorry, of other characters though, not the narrator, but entering into other people's thoughts.
The Sanin Izumi Shikibu Nikki, and even in the the Kagiro, if I can't think of an exact example, but where she actually imagines what another person is thinking,
Mhm.
and transcribes it.
Mhm.
But yeah.
But I think you're definitely right that maybe, in reading modern American history, like history of, historians or today would probably shy away from, they would try to quote from documents or primary sources to enliven those voices or incorporate those voices into their discussion if they wanted to. But, I guess the idea of like kind of interior monologue and assuming and this is what that person may have said and trying to like recreate that voice puts it into the Rekshi Monogatari or historical fiction genre, right? Because you are imagining and you have maybe very good reasons to imagine that kind of how it may have been. And that I think is a very powerful way to vivify history, right? The past. But it takes it into the realm of perhaps fiction or perhaps historical or literature rather than hardcore or so-called hardcore history.
We have a whole wealth of questions, so I think we can move into a sort of lightning round. Or I have a few questions that I wanted to pose from those who have posted them. And if time doesn't allow, of course, we can always follow up afterwards. So I'll start by giving priority to a student working at UBC who asked about awase. I was intrigued by your mentioning of organizing relationships as awase, and I was wondering if you could give an example. I'm very excited to read your book.
Yes. So there are lots of different awase, and I think I think in some ways one could even expand it to the idea of history and fiction, right? And that kind of combination, which undergirds the whole Eiga Monogatari itself. But I think more maybe specifically, at least in the Zokuhen, it does move into the Insei period actually. So for me, I thought one configuration of the Awase is again this new relationship between the Fujiwara and the imperial line, and this changing kind of political balance of power and the relationship, and trying to navigate this new relationship politically. Through ceremonies, through games, through this so the depiction. So there's awase in terms of the structure, but there's also awase being depicted too at the same time. I think kind of mirroring each other. I think and actually in the Koma Kurabe Gyoko Emaki, this scene is with at Yorimichi's villa Kayano Inn. And as you can see from my background, it's very tranquil. They have the boats on the pond, and actually the moon is the moon is reflected in the pond. I don't know if you can see the moon, and it's a very tranquil scene. And the other scene actually depicts the emperor's visit, and so there are lots of carriages and there's a lot of movement. And so I think very much reminiscent of the Nenju Gyoji Emaki. And with like the kind of boisterous, the oxen and kind of rambunctious people and people just mulling around, which again, so there's this kind of interesting way in which the surviving scene at least has this scene of both quiet and boisterousness, right? And so I think there are lots of ways in which I think this awase can be deployed. And I try to use it again because it was such a predominant way of predominant game, right? Or in that it may have, so that I try to use this concept to think about the literary representation as well.
So we may only have time for about one more question, but I want to shift to the reception a little bit. We have a question about Motoori Norinaga and Hirata Atsutane, both citing Eiga Monogatari as providing evidence for people returning from the dead or returning from Yomi, returning for Yomi. Could you give some idea of the context in which this happened?
Okay, so that's really actually, I have to confess, I didn't know about these mentions. So thank you. And it's actually really exciting. I should look into it. And so So I may have misheard, or so there's mention that Eiga provides mentions of people returning from Yomi. And I guess so. I wonder if those examples are understood to be the Mononoke, right, or scenes of spirit possession that Eiga actually has a number of. And if so, then like there's a number of scenes, especially that I analyze, and I was especially interested in the daughter-father pairs, like Motokata and his daughter, and Akimitsu, Fujiwara no Akimitsu and his daughters actually come back as spirit possessions after, and those are also, I think, after their deaths. And actually, even though in Genji, I think so much of Lady Rokujo's spirit is so famous that we tend to assume Mononoke or tend to be of living people. But in fact, that's the historically rare example, Ikiryo, and that usually the spirit possessions, Mononoke, stem from dead people. And so I think that's also a real interesting way in which Eiga Monogatari adds to our understanding of spirit possession in the Heian period.
Thank you. And if we have time, which I think we do, there's an additional question related to Mumyo Zoshi. And this question was actually raised during a previous book launch with Aaron Brightwell's new book on Kagami Mono. And it's by somebody who's working on Mumyo Zoshi right now. And there's a section at the end of Mumyo Zoshi that talks about Yotsugi and Okagami, with Yotsugi, the male narrator of Okagami, apparently referring to Eiga, which seems odd, right? So what do you make of a feminine text being referred to by the male narrator of a completely separate work?
Okay.
Do you have any insights there?
I don't know if I have any insights necessarily, but I think Yotsugi and the etymology of Yotsugi may have some clues. I think Yotsugi may, if you look at the word itself, is more about like chronicle, or maybe a reference not to the narrator of Okagami. And it's in the case of Eiga Monogatari, it was referred to as Yotsugi, but I don't know if that's because the narrator of Okagami was named Yotsugi, and that's how it kind of got that name, or whether it's a reference, if it's more just means chronicle, right? If it was a more generic term, it had no real, it wasn't supposed to have, whether it stemmed from Okagami. I don't really have other, I'll have to think about it. And actually, and if we do have, just before we end, or if we have to just cut off somehow, I do want to mention that I'm sure it seems like I'm really excited. There's just so many questions. I'll be happy to also, you can find me online, you can find my university webpage, and please do write to me if you have follow-up things you'd like to talk about.
Thank you. Well, before I wrap up, I just wanted to see, do you have any final comments you wanted to offer of any sort, or thoughts based on the discussion? You're not obviously obliged to, but Sonja and Gus, did you want to add anything? If not, we'll wrap up, but you're most welcome to.
Gus, you go first.
You go first. No, I think I've said I don't have anything to add at this point.
No, I'm good too. I've been reading the questions too as they've been coming up on the side. There's been some wonderful questions, and I expect there's going to be follow-up with Professor Watanabe too, and that's great.
Well, in that case, I have to say how exciting and wondrous I find it to be here with close to 100 people before, as people are gradually trickling out to attend to other duties. To see that many people come out for a session on Eiga really makes my heart sing. And as Dr. Watanabe said, in terms of narrative, he was focusing on this notion of bringing people together and forging community in some sense. And it's always so exciting to be here with everyone. as we're spread throughout the globe. And I know many of you are staying up late to attend this or waking up early or possibly joining us in the middle of the night. So I first just wanted to extend my thanks to all of you for coming. I wanted to also note that we'll be sending out a follow-up survey. You're welcome to give us feedback. We incorporate that every time. And we'll be following up next month with a book launch, which will be on Laura Moretti's Pleasure and Profit, Popular Prose in 17th Century Japan. We're pinning down the details now. But finally, I wanted to thank all of our presenter today, Takeshi Watanabe. Thank him for creating this wonderful book. And thank you to Professors Heldt and Arntzen for taking the time to really engage with the book and offer their reading and wonderful questions. So thank you again all for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month.